All right, everybody. Thank you for joining today's PTASP webinar. This is the second in a series of 2 PTASP webinars that DRPT is hosting aimed at our Tier 2 transit providers that participated in the original Tier 2 group PTASP plan. I'm joined today by the folks at TRA who are going to be walking you all through some important changes to the PTASP related to the bipartisan infrastructure bill. With that, I'm going to turn things over to the TRA team to take us through the slides today.
Thank you, Wood. Hi, good morning, everyone. Like Wood said, this webinar is hosted by DRPT with support from both AECOM and TRA. My name is Kathleen Martin, and my colleague Sherry Vernon and I will be delivering this presentation for you today. And we have our colleagues Rob and Wood here as well. We do just want to go over some webinar protocols. We do encourage everyone to use the chat feature for questions, and we have someone monitoring that, and we'll plan to answer questions at the end of the presentation. Our main objective today is to review both PTASP, so Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan, and BIL, Bipartisan Infrastructure Law requirements, so that all agencies can take that knowledge and apply it to both reviewing your current PTASP to make sure that all elements are included and accurate, and so that you can add in new BIL requirements. And again, here we'd just like to emphasize that although DRPT worked with covered agencies to help write your initial PTASPs, DRPT is not reviewing or updating agency PTASPs this time around. DRPT is available to answer questions and provide technical support, but will not be directly updating your PTASPs for your agency. Moving into our agenda for today, we went through introductions already of the team. We'll start off then with a little bit of a PTASP refresher, an introduction to the BIL, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, including requirement applicability, and then we'll move kind of really into the meat of the presentation as we review the detailed PTASP and BIL requirements. We'll then give some information on next steps and have time for, like I said earlier, those questions at the end. So feel free to continue to type those into the chat as we move through the presentation. So starting out with a bit of a refresher into Public Transportation Agency Safety Plans, or PTASPs, we'll kind of ask that question, what is a PTASP? A PTASP is a safety plan that lays out processes and procedures of safety management systems, or SMS, that transit agencies need to do to safely and effectively manage risk at their agencies. A little bit more background, in July 2018, the FTA published the PTASP Final Rule, also known as Code of Federal Regulations Title 49, Part 673. So you'll hear us throughout this presentation refer to that just kind of as Part 673 to cut down on that length. And Part 673 requires operators of public transit systems that receive federal funds under FTA's urbanized area formula grants to develop these safety plans. So Part 673 sets scalable and flexible standards for safety plans, including requirements for the identification, assessment, and mitigation of risks, and strategies to minimize exposure to hazards. Safety training programs are part of that as well, setting safety performance targets, and a process and timeline for conducting an annual review and update of your safety plan. Again, just reviewing safety management systems, or SMS refresher a little bit. SMS is a comprehensive approach to managing safety that brings management and labor together to manage risk better through the identification and mitigation of safety problems early, through sharing and analyzing safety data more effectively, and through measuring safety performance. So again, breaking down SMS just a little bit farther, there are 4 main elements: safety management policy, safety risk management, safety assurance, and safety promotion. And we will go over each of those in detail as we continue to review the PTASP requirements. But just at a high level, Each of these components really works together to form that SMS process and aims to manage transit agency risk more effectively. And the 5 questions listed under those 4 main components are really kind of, questions that you can ask yourself to make sure there are all of these correct processes in place for all of the components of SMS. So I'll just kind of pause there briefly. I don't think I see any questions in the chat, but if there are any questions regarding just a PTASP refresher, feel free to put them in the chat. I don't see any right now. So we'll continue to move on to the bipartisan infrastructure law. So the bipartisan infrastructure law, we'll use the acronym BIL, or just call it the bill, BIL. And it could also be referred to as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA. So you may hear it referred to as a couple different ways. We'll just be talking about it as the BIL in this presentation. The BIL was signed into law last year in November of 2021 and created additional PTASP requirements for transit agencies that are required to already have an agency safety plan under that Part 673 that we just discussed. So we will be going through these requirements in more detail throughout the remainder of the presentation, but just at a high level, a few of those new requirements from the BIL include the creation of a safety committee for agencies that serve large urbanized areas. And we did go through that in depth in our last webinar in July. And again, we will be going over it today as well. Another requirement for all agencies is to address strategies to minimize exposure to infectious diseases. Again, we'll be going over all these in more detail, but just at a high level, it's good to know that some of these new requirements. So continuing on with BIL applicability, we did review this a bit in our first presentation in July, but just as a refresher, we do want to let everyone know that most of the BIL requirements that we'll be reviewing today are based on the size of the urbanized area, or UZA, that an agency serves. So whether that urbanized area has a population of over or under 200,000 people will be that dividing line there for most of the majority, for the majority of the new requirements from the BIL. And it is important to emphasize here that if any part of your agency's route hits that large UZA, so 200,000 or more for the population, then most of these BIL requirements will apply to your agency. And here are the agencies that fall into those 2 categories of serving a smaller or larger UZA. The agencies in the right-hand column are the ones that are subject to a little bit more of those stringent requirements because at least one of their routes serves a portion of a large urbanized area. And we have put the urbanized area, that is the large urbanized area, in parentheses there next to the transit agency, just for reference. And then in the left-hand column, we have transit agencies that serve UZAs with a population of 200,000 or less. So not as many of those BIL requirements will apply to those agencies because they do not serve a large UZA. So now we'll start to get into a review of PTASP requirements. And I just want to highlight again that all of the agencies here today have an existing PTASP. So all of the elements that we discussed today regarding to just PTASP requirements should be checked to make sure they're updated and accurate to reflect any changes at your agency since you wrote your initial PTASP, but you should already have all of this information in your PTASP. So in terms of general requirements, transit agencies need to include the name and address of their transit agency that the PTASP applies to, the mode or modes of transit covered by the PTASP, the mode or modes of transit service provided, and then just provided by the agency. It's required to have the accountable executive signature on the PTASP and that date of approval. Similarly, the board of directors or equivalent authorities approval and the date of that approval need to be included. Certification of compliance with Part 673 that we described earlier is required. And finally, we have the requirement of safety performance targets. And there are 4 categories of safety performance targets that need to be included that we will go into detail over the next 4 slides. but it is important to note that you should already have these safety performance targets set. So we're recommending that you review these as we approach level of a level of. We also recommend that agencies use service again. And we the National Transit Database, or again, ahead of resetting them to make sure that they're accurate and up to date. The first safety performance target that needs to be accounted for is fatalities. For the fatality safety performance measure, FTA uses the NTD definition of fatality, so a death confirmed within 30 days, and excludes trespassing and suicide-related fatalities. So this means that although you may have to report a trespassing fatality to the NTD, you would exclude that trespassing fatality from your fatality performance target. Like I also just briefly mentioned, another example is overdose deaths, which are not reportable and do not need to be included in the fatality safety performance target. So the fatality safety performance target is expressed as the total number of reportable fatalities and the rate per total vehicle revenue miles. The second safety performance target to review is injuries. The FTA uses the NTD definition of injury, so harm to a person requiring immediate medical attention away from the scene. FTA uses injuries reported on both the NTD major and non-major forms and excludes injuries resulting from assault and other crimes, which are considered security events. So this means that you may have to report a crime-related injury to NTD, but you would exclude that injury from your injury performance target. And the injury performance target, again, similar to fatalities, is expressed as the total number of reportable injuries and then the rate per total vehicle revenue miles. For our third safety performance target, we have safety events, and the FTA uses all safety events meeting the NTD definition of a major event threshold. So for this measure, FTA includes only major safety events and excludes major security events. So this means that you may have to report a major event to NTD, but you would exclude that security event from your safety performance targets. The safety events performance target is, again, very similar to fatalities and injuries, expressed as that total number of reportable safety events and then the rate per total vehicle revenue miles. The final safety performance target measures system reliability. So this is a little different than the past three that we just discussed. The system reliability target is expressed in miles and is the mean or average distance between major or minor mechanical failures. So the NTD defines a major mechanical system failure as a failure of some mechanical element of the revenue vehicle that prevents the vehicle from completing a scheduled revenue trip or from starting the next scheduled revenue trip because actual movement is limited or because of safety concerns. And a minor failure is pretty much anything that doesn't meet that major failure threshold. So to calculate the mean distance between failures for a transit mode, you would divide the total vehicle revenue miles by the total number of failures. So we're staying in the PTASP general requirements section, but we're now moving on to a new bipartisan infrastructure law requirement. So this is something that you will need to add to your PTASP. And this requirement is for agencies serving a UZA with a population of 200,000 or fewer. So this is one of the requirements that only applies to agencies serving that smaller UZA. And the BIL requires that the development of your PTASP be in cooperation with frontline employee representatives. So it's important to note here that this BIL requirement is not the same as the formal safety committee creation and approval. This is not the same requirement. This requirement just needs PTASP development in cooperation with frontline employee representation. So then moving into our safety management policy, some requirements that are included that are necessary are a written statement of the safety management policy that is communicated throughout the entire agencies, authorities, accountabilities, and responsibilities for the management of safety as they relate to the development and management of a transit agency's SMS. So those authorities, accountabilities, and responsibilities need to be described for the accountable executive, the chief safety officer, agency leadership, and other key staff, which could include operations and maintenance managers, training managers, facilities personnel, purchasing and procurement personnel, etc. And finally, we have the requirement of an employee safety reporting program, which does have several necessary components that we'll review on this slide. So the employee safety reporting program must include the following, and that is a process that allows employees to report safety conditions to management. And this is really is an important factor because it allows regularly communicated to the employees and agency contractors. If employees aren't aware that they can report a safety concern and how they're not sure how to report it, that has a direct impact on employees' perception of safety culture. So that second necessary piece of the employee safety reporting program is protections for employees who then do report safety conditions and concerns to senior management. And third is the description of employee behaviors that may result in disciplinary actions and are therefore excluded from that protection that is the previous requirement. And now I am going to hand things off to my colleague Sherry to finish out the presentation.
Thank you, Kathleen. Good morning, everyone. So the next component of SMS that we will discuss today is safety risk management. And the intention of safety risk management, or SRM, it's a process to actively manage the transit agency's safety risks. And this component is broken down into 3 elements: safety risk identification, safety risk assessment, and safety risk mitigation, which we will expand on over the next few slides. Next slide, please. So first, the first element in the SRM process is safety risk identification. So your PTASP must include methods or processes to identify hazards and consequences of those hazards. So a commonly used hazard identification source in some agencies is the agency's employee hazard reporting program. So this is a very effective method because your frontline employees are familiar with the operating environment and are likely to be the most aware of the existing hazards. And the transit agency must also consider outside sources for hazard identification, such as any state or federal oversight authority, like DRPT or the FTA. Next slide, please. Next, the second element of the SRM process is safety risk assessment. So again, your agency must identify methods or processes that now assess the safety risks associated with the identified hazards. And a safety risk assessment will evaluate both the likelihood of occurrence and the severity of the consequences. And this assessment may also include the evaluation of existing mitigations. And then this process also allows for the prioritization of the hazards based on that determined safety risk. Next slide, please. So as previously mentioned, the safety risk assessment includes the combination of a hazard's likelihood and probability, as we see illustrated here in the Military Standard 882E table. Now, this is a standard risk assessment that's used throughout the transit industry. However, agencies do reserve the right to select the risk assessment tool that is best suited for your agency. So the top category here lists the ranges of severity of a hazard. So the most severe category is catastrophic. So something that would result in death, permanent disability, significant or irreversible environmental impact, or monetary loss equal to or exceeding $10 million. And then the least severe is negligible, which would result in injury, illness, not resulting in a lost workday, minimal environmental impact, or monetary loss less than $100,000. The lower category lists the ranges of probability. So the most probable is frequent, so likely to occur or continuously experienced in the system. And the least probable is eliminated. So it's incapable of occurrence because a hazard was identified and eliminated. And then the color-coded table that you see on the left would provide you with the hazard rating based on the combination of those two factors. So for example, an item that's scored a 1A is the highest risk, right? So that's a combination of catastrophic and frequent. And then 4F is a score with low or no risk, negligible or eliminated. Next slide, please. And then the final element of safety risk management, of the safety risk management process, is safety risk mitigation. So once the agencies have established a process to identify and assess the hazards, they must also establish methods and processes to identify mitigations that will reduce the likelihood and severity of the hazards. Again, all three of these elements of the SRM process may already be included in your PTASP, but again, you want to ensure that those are included. Next slide, please. So while we discussed earlier that the majority of the BIL requirements are divided by the urbanized area, one requirement that is applicable to all transit agencies is the establishment of strategies to minimize the exposure of the public, personnel, and property to hazards and unsafe conditions, and the establishment of strategies consistent with the guidelines of the CDC and the Virginia Department of Health to minimize exposure to infectious diseases. Now, this fits right into the safety risk management subsection because transit agencies are continuously identifying related hazards, assessing and ensuring mitigation strategies are in place to reduce the risk of exposure to infectious diseases and other related hazards. So again, we just want to note here that we discussed this during our July webinar. This is a new requirement, so we want to make sure that it is included in your PTASP. Next slide, please. So the next SMS component that we will discuss is safety assurance. So this process helps to ensure that any mitigations that are put in place to manage safety risks are carried out working as intended, and that the overall safety objectives are being met. And this process may also identify any potential safety issues that may have been introduced by the mitigation. So some safety performance monitoring and measurement elements that need to be included in your PTASP are activities that monitor the agency's system for compliance with and also the sufficiency of procedures for operations and maintenance. So for example, your PTASP may identify various compliance monitoring activities such as ride observations or ride-alongs, observing a maintenance task being conducted, reviewing pre-trip inspections, etc. Next slide, please. Your PTASP must also describe activities to monitor the transit agency's operation to identify any safety risk mitigations that may be ineffective, inappropriate, or that were not implemented as intended. So in this area, agencies just need to make sure that they clearly describe what that process looks like for you. How do you determine if your mitigation is ineffective? Next slide, please. So finally, the PTASP must also detail the processes put in place to monitor information that's reported through any internal safety reporting programs. So this may be in the form of, this information may be collected in the form of suggestion boxes, formal reports, hotlines, or verbal reports from the employees. And the agency must demonstrate how the safety reporting is being received, resolved, and reported out to the appropriate parties, just ensuring that closed loop of communication. Next slide, please. And then in addition to monitoring activities, this section of your PTASP should also include activities to conduct investigations of safety events. So this description needs to include the identification of causal factors, investigation report requirements, SOPs for response, investigation, and accident notification, any internal and external notification reporting requirements, and also any coordination that may be required with local law enforcement or emergency responders. Next slide, please. And we also have a BIL safety committee requirement with safety assurance. So for agencies serving urbanized areas with a population of 200,000 or more, the BIL requires the establishment of a safety committee that does two things. It consists of an equal number of frontline employee representatives or contractors and management representatives, and is convened by a joint labor management process as applicable. So again, as we discussed during the July presentation, Some agencies are not unionized, so in this case, the agency just needs to ensure that the committee is formed in conjunction with frontline employees. Next slide, please. So the safety committee has 4 primary objectives. First, they should be identifying and recommending risk-based mitigations to reduce the likelihood and severity of consequences identified through the agency's safety risk assessment, identifying mitigations or strategies that may be ineffective, identifying safety deficiencies for the purpose of continuous improvement, and approving the agency safety plan and any future updates. Slide, please. So as a reminder, the BIL Safety Committee requirement deadline was on July 31st of this year, so that has passed. And looking ahead, your agency safety committee must approve the PTASP no later than December 31st. So all of these new requirements must be incorporated and the plan must be approved no later than December 31st. Next slide, please. So then the final SMS component is safety promotion. And within this component, your PTASP must identify a comprehensive safety training program for all transit agency employees and contractors designated as directly responsible for safety within the agency. And this program must include a refresher training. In your PTASP, you should reference which positions in operations and maintenance are subjected to this training process. Excuse me. Reference standalone training handouts, workbooks, and other materials. Identify who is responsible for providing the training and how the agency measures how effective the training has been and if it's been completed. Refresher training requirements and how training records will be maintained for a minimum of 3 years in accordance with FTA requirements for record keeping. Next slide, please. So a second requirement within safety promotion is the communication of safety and safety performance information throughout the transit agency's organization. So at minimum, this communication must convey information on hazards and safety risks that are relevant to the employee's roles and responsibilities, safety actions that are taken in response to reports that are submitted through an employee safety reporting program. So some examples of ways that agencies can fulfill this requirement of communication includes communicating during committee meetings, safety briefings, toolbox talks, posters and bulletins in the break room, as well as direct communication with the affected employees. Next slide, please. So under the newly implemented BIL requirement for UZAs serving 200,000 or more, a comprehensive training program must be provided for both operations and maintenance personnel who are directly responsible for safety. So again, this is a new requirement. So this program again needs to include the completion of a safety training program, continuing safety education and training, and de-escalation training, again, which is another new requirement. So agencies must provide trainings to safety, operations, and maintenance personnel that focuses on prevention strategies against assaults and related incidents. And currently, the National Transit Institute offers a pre-recorded training titled Assault Awareness and Prevention for Transit Operators. However, agencies have the flexibility to develop training in-house based on industry best practices or outsource de-escalation training for their staff. And one thing to consider, if your agency has a close working relationship with your local law enforcement, that's another potential resource to leverage for de-escalation training. Next slide, please. And finally, transit agencies must establish a risk reduction program for operations to improve safety by reducing the number and rate of accidents, injuries, and assaults on transit workers based on data from the National Transit Database, NTD. So this program must include a reduction of vehicular and pedestrian accidents involving buses that include measures to reduce visibility impairments for bus operators that contribute to accidents. So for example, agencies may consider ensuring that they have a strong relationship with municipalities that are responsible for maintenance. So something that comes to mind is, proper tree trimming. And obviously if the trees are trimmed and maintained, that improves the operator's visibility while driving. And then also the program must include the mitigation of assaults on transit workers, including the deployment of assault mitigation infrastructure and technology on buses, including barriers to restrict the unwanted entry of individuals and objects into the workstations of bus operators. Next slide, please. So that concludes the our SMS coverage. So the next steps, agencies will be able to reference this webinar and July's webinar for future reference. And you may also consider accessing the FTA's webinar page to view some of their webinars that are relevant to the SMS practices that we've discussed here. And we've provided a list of example webinars that are available, including safety risk assessment and practice, SMS techniques for monitoring operations and maintenance procedures, implementing safety risk assessment approaches, and using the NTD to support safety analysis. And again, there are many more webinars that are available, and you guys can always access those. And then again, we're here to provide technical assistance. DRPT, PTASP, and BIL requirements checklists will be distributed for agency use. As a reminder, DRPT will not be modifying PTASP on behalf of the agencies. And again, just a deadline reminder, the final BIL law deadline is December 31st of this year. And next slide, and that concludes our presentation today. Does anyone have any questions or comments at this time? Okay, I guess I'll hand it back over to Lloyd.
It looks like Queenie has a question. Let's see if we can get her unmuted so she can ask her question. Queenie, do you want to put your question in the chat? Oh, okay, I see. When will the checklist be available? We'll distribute that checklist shortly. I'll send a follow-up email with a copy of this PowerPoint presentation and a copy of that checklist, and along with any other useful links. One question I did have is, in terms of updating PTASPs, I know a common thing right now is, with staffing changes and staffing level changes, agencies might have combined roles. You might have a safety manager who's also an operations manager, where those were two separate positions. If you're combining those roles, would you necessarily need to update your PTASP to reflect that in your organizational structure and the way that you discuss responsibility for safety at an agency?
So the answer is yes. You want to make sure that all of the organizational changes that have taken place since you last wrote your agency safety plan are accurately captured in how you describe different roles and responsibilities for your executive team and your key staff. And it's okay for small transit providers to not have a dedicated, separate chief safety officer. That can be the accountable executive, that could be the operations manager, but just somebody has to be designated. For some of your agencies, which are a little bit larger, you may have the resources to have that separate safety officer, and that's fine. But on the other hand, if there's been a change, if positional responsibilities have changed, then that should be captured in the update to your safety plan. Just consider it a living document that needs to be updated at least once a year, if to the extent that you have significant changes to your organization and roles and responsibilities with regard to safety.
Thanks, Rob. Also, when it comes to small agencies and getting input from their frontline employees, would things like discussing a PTASP at a existing safety meeting and just documenting that it's been discussed at that meeting kind of be enough in terms of involvement for your frontline employees? So, taking minutes at the meeting or taking an attendance list, just so an agency has documentation that it's been discuss with their frontline staff to kind of make sure that they have that evidence if FTA asks for it.
Yeah, indeed, you can make use of existing processes that you have going on at the agency. If you have a staff meeting with your bus drivers and your mechanics, that's a good place to talk about this safety plan and make sure that they have the opportunity to take a look at it and raise any concerns that they may have. For the large urbanized area agencies, their process needs to be a little bit more formalized. But for the small urbanized area agencies, that process using your existing meetings, using your existing processes, that's kind of the way to go with that. Another thing that you could do is there's a section in the PTASP where you talk about the process used to review and update the document, and make sure that what you do to do that with your staff is just briefly described in there. So if it is done during a meeting, that's a good place to talk about that.
Great. Are there any other questions from our attendees? If not, I'm always reachable via email. Also, you can direct questions to your program managers. If they do not know the answer, they're probably going to come to me. So if people have specific questions when they get into their reviews or when they start looking through the PowerPoint, please reach out. We will help you the best we can. I'll also mention that we did record today's presentation, and we will also make a copy of the recording available on our YouTube page, and then put a link on the DRPT PTASP page, which will be kind of our resource for capturing all of the guidance and webinars going forward. So with that, I'll thank everybody for your time and give everybody back half an hour of their day. Pretty much concludes what we had to offer today. Thank you all for attending.